The moment Sandra Walsh from HR told me my promised raise got lost somewhere in the legal department, I knew something was terribly wrong. 6 months earlier, I had created a revolutionary data compression algorithm that saved our biggest client, Patterson Industries, millions of dollars in server costs. My direct supervisor, Jake, had been avoiding eye contact with me for weeks, practically sprinting in the opposite direction whenever he saw me coming down the hallway. The nervous energy radiating from him made my stomach churn with suspicion. I had worked at TechFlow Solutions for 2 years, climbing from junior developer to senior developer through sheer determination and countless late nights debugging code. But now, staring at Sandra's uncomfortable expression as she shuffled papers on her desk, I realized my breakthrough innovation had somehow become my biggest problem. Something about my employment contract was about to change everything. 3 weeks after that unsettling conversation with Sandra, I finally decided to dig deeper into the mystery surrounding my missing raise. The Austin heat was particularly brutal that Tuesday morning as I sat in my cramped apartment, surrounded by legal documents I had never bothered to read carefully when I first joined TechFlow Solutions. My roommate Diana, a sharp paralegal at a downtown firm, had offered to help me understand the complex terminology buried in my employment contract. She spread the papers across our kitchen table, her blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail as she adjusted her reading glasses. "Ophelia, look at this clause on page 7, she said, pointing to a paragraph I had completely overlooked during my hiring process. This intellectual property section is incredibly detailed for a standard employment agreement. I leaned over her shoulder, reading the dense legal language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. The clause stated that any software innovations generating over $50 million in client revenue would automatically trigger royalty payments equal to 15% of the licensing fees received by the company. "Wait, that cannot be right," I muttered, grabbing my laptop to pull up the financial reports I had access to as a senior developer. Patterson Industries paid us for the algorithm licensing, but I never saw any paperwork about royalty calculations. Diana's expression grew serious as I scrolled through the quarterly earnings statements. TechFlow had reported $78 million in licensing revenue from Patterson Industries alone, with my compression algorithm listed as the primary technology asset in the transaction. My hands began trembling as the mathematics became clear. 15% of $78 million meant I was owed over $11 million in royalty payments. But my bank account held exactly $2,347, barely enough to cover rent and groceries for the month. "This explains why Jake has been acting so strangely," I said, remembering how my supervisor had started excluding me from client meetings and redirecting my emails to his own inbox. "He knows about this clause, and he knows the company owes me a fortune." Diana pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of every page of my contract. "We need to document everything before you confront anyone at work. Corporate lawyers have ways of making inconvenient contracts disappear if employees do not protect themselves properly." Over the next few days, I began gathering evidence systematically. I printed copies of every email related to the Patterson Industries project, saved screenshots of the financial reports, and created a detailed timeline of my algorithm development process. The more I investigated, the more obvious it became that TechFlow was deliberately hiding my royalty entitlement. My breakthrough had occurred during a particularly stressful period when Patterson Industries threatened to cancel their contract due to server performance issues. I had worked 18-hour days for 3 weeks straight, surviving on coffee and determination, while developing a compression method that reduced their data storage needs by 67%. The solution was elegant in its simplicity, using predictive modeling to identify redundant information patterns before they were written to storage systems. Patterson Industries immediately implemented the algorithm across their entire network infrastructure, saving them millions in hardware costs and dramatically improving their system response times. But instead of celebrating my success, TechFlow had quietly negotiated the licensing deal without informing me about the royalty implications. Jake Patterson, my supervisor, whose surname coincidentally matched our biggest client, had handled all the contract discussions while I focused on technical implementation details. "The timing of everything makes sense now," I told Diana as we reviewed my evidence collection. Jake started acting nervous right after the licensing agreement was finalized. He knew exactly how much money was involved, and he knew I had no idea about my contractual rights. Sandra Walsh from HR had been equally evasive whenever I tried to schedule follow-up meetings about my raise. Her assistant kept claiming Sandra was traveling or in meetings, but I had seen her car in the company parking lot every day that week. As I prepared to confront the company about my discovery, I could not shake the feeling that this situation was much bigger than a simple oversight. The deliberate nature of the concealment suggested a systematic effort to defraud employees of their contractual compensation. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or you will regret it." The message sent chills down my spine, confirming that someone at TechFlow was monitoring my investigation efforts. But instead of intimidating me into silence, the threat only strengthened my resolve to uncover the truth. I had spent years building my reputation as a skilled developer, and I refused to let corporate greed steal the fruits of my intellectual labor. The next morning, I discovered that my keycard access to the advanced development servers had been mysteriously revoked, and my upcoming performance review had been indefinitely postponed. The company was clearly trying to limit my ability to gather additional evidence while they figured out how to handle my growing awareness of their deception. Diana helped me understand that contract fraud of this magnitude could result in criminal charges against company executives, making the situation far more serious than a simple employment dispute. We decided that my next step would be demanding a meeting with CEO Richard Blackstone to present my evidence and request immediate compliance with my contractual royalty rights. As I drove to work that Friday morning, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, I realized that my discovery of the royalty clause had transformed me from a satisfied employee into a potential whistleblower whose revelations could bring down the entire executive leadership team at TechFlow Solutions. Armed with my financial evidence and Diana's legal guidance, I marched into Sandra Walsh's office the following Monday morning, demanding answers about my contractual royalties. Sandra's usual professional demeanor cracked immediately, her eyes darting nervously toward the ceiling-mounted security camera before she gestured for me to close the door. "Ophelia, I understand your confusion about the compensation structure," she began, her voice lacking its typical confidence. "But your contract was amended before the Patterson Industries agreement was finalized. The royalty clause no longer applies to your employment terms." I pulled out my tablet and showed her the original contract I had signed 2 years earlier. "Where is my signature on this supposed amendment? I never agreed to modify my intellectual property rights, and any contract changes require both parties' written consent." Sandra's face flushed red as she fumbled through her filing cabinet, clearly searching for documentation that did not exist. "The amendment was processed through our legal department. I cannot access those files without proper authorization from our general counsel." "Then let me speak with the general counsel immediately," I replied, maintaining steady eye contact despite my racing heartbeat. "I want to see exactly what modifications were allegedly made to my employment agreement." Sandra's evasive responses only strengthened my suspicion that TechFlow had fabricated the contract amendment story to justify withholding my royalty payments. I left her office with a formal written request for all documentation related to my employment terms, giving the company 48 hours to produce the records or face legal action. That afternoon, my coworker Tommy Rodriguez approached me during our lunch break, glancing around cautiously before sitting across from me in the company cafeteria. Tommy had worked at TechFlow for 4 years, long enough to witness several suspicious departures of talented developers who had created valuable innovations. 3 other programmers discovered similar problems with their contracts over the past 2 years, Tommy whispered, keeping his voice barely audible above the ambient noise. Sarah Mitchell from the mobile development team, David Brooks from the artificial intelligence division, and Jennifer Walsh from cybersecurity. All of them were quietly terminated within weeks of raising questions about missing royalty payments. My appetite disappeared as Tommy described the pattern of retaliation against employees who challenged the company's intellectual property practices. Each terminated developer had signed confidential severance agreements that prevented them from discussing their experiences publicly or pursuing legal remediation. "How much money are we talking about across all these cases?" I asked, already dreading the answer. Tommy pulled out his smartphone and showed me a spreadsheet he had been secretly maintaining. "Based on the revenue reports I can access through my database administrator privileges, TechFlow has generated over $300 million from employee innovations without paying a single cent in contractual royalties." The scope of the fraud was staggering, affecting dozens of developers whose creative work had been systematically exploited by company executives. Tommy explained that Jake Patterson had been specifically hired 18 months earlier to manage employee relations in the development department, which apparently meant suppressing royalty claims through intimidation and contract manipulation. Jake is not even a real software engineer, Tommy revealed. His background is in corporate security and employee surveillance. The company brought him in specifically because his last name creates psychological pressure when dealing with Patterson Industries disputes. I realized that Jake's nervous behavior around me stemmed from his knowledge of the illegal scheme rather than simple workplace awkwardness. He had been tasked with monitoring my activities and preventing me from discovering the royalty clause activation that should have triggered massive payments months earlier. That evening, Diana helped me research Jake Patterson's employment history through professional networking sites and public records. His previous positions included corporate investigator at a union-busting firm and compliance officer at a company that had been fined by the Department of Labor for wage theft violations. This guy is a professional suppressor of employee rights, Diana concluded after reviewing his resume. TechFlow hired him specifically to handle situations like yours without triggering legal liability for the executives. Over the next 3 days, I began secretly recording my conversations with company management using an app Diana had recommended. Texas is a one-party consent state, meaning I could legally record conversations as long as I was a participant providing crucial evidence for any future legal proceedings. During a recorded conversation with Jake about my project assignments, he inadvertently revealed that CEO Richard Blackstone personally reviewed all intellectual property agreements before major client deals were finalized. This admission proved that the highest levels of company leadership were aware of the royalty clauses and had deliberately chosen to conceal them from affected employees. I also discovered through careful investigation of company financial records that TechFlow had established offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands specifically for managing intellectual property licensing revenue. The complex financial structure appeared designed to obscure the true amounts owed to developers while maximizing corporate profits from their innovations. My algorithm had generated licensing agreements with 12 different companies beyond Patterson Industries, creating a total revenue stream exceeding $200 million. According to my contract terms, I was entitled to $30 million in royalty payments that had been systematically diverted to executive bonuses and corporate investments. The evidence was becoming overwhelming, but I needed more concrete proof of deliberate fraud before confronting CEO Blackstone directly. Tommy provided me with access logs showing that Jake Patterson had been forging electronic signatures on contract amendments using administrator privileges, creating fake documentation to support the company's claims about modified employment terms. On Thursday evening, I received another threatening text message. Last warning, drop this investigation or face consequences. The message included a photo of my car in the company parking lot, demonstrating that someone was actively monitoring my movements and trying to intimidate me into submission. Instead of backing down, I forwarded the threatening message to Diana and decided to accelerate my confrontation timeline. The company's increasingly desperate attempts to silence me proved that my investigation was exposing criminal activity that could destroy TechFlow's reputation and result in serious legal consequences for the executives involved. I scheduled a meeting with CEO Richard Blackstone for the following Monday morning, ostensibly to discuss my career development and future project assignments. But I plan to present my evidence of contract fraud and demand immediate payment of all owed royalties, forcing him to either comply with my contractual rights or face public exposure of the systematic employee exploitation scheme. As I prepared for this most important confrontation of my professional life, I realized that my discovery of the royalty clause had evolved from a personal employment dispute into a potential criminal investigation that could bring justice for dozens of exploited developers and fundamentally change how TechFlow Solutions operated. Monday morning arrived with an unexpected thunderstorm that seemed to mirror my emotional state as I prepared for my meeting with CEO Richard Blackstone. I had spent the weekend organizing my evidence into a comprehensive presentation that documented every aspect of TechFlow's systematic fraud against its development staff. Diana had coached me extensively on confrontation strategy, emphasizing the importance of remaining calm and professional while presenting facts that could potentially send executives to prison. I wore my most confident business outfit and arrived at the executive floor 30 minutes early, using the extra time to review my notes and practice my opening statement. Richard Blackstone's corner office was intimidatingly luxurious, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Austin and expensive artwork that probably cost more than my annual salary. He greeted me with his trademark corporate smile, the same expression he used during company-wide meetings when announcing record profits while simultaneously freezing employee wages. "Ophelia, I am delighted we finally have an opportunity to discuss your future with TechFlow," he said, gesturing toward a leather chair positioned directly across from his massive mahogany desk. "Your technical contributions have been absolutely invaluable to our recent growth." I sat down and immediately opened my laptop, connecting it to the presentation screen without waiting for his permission. "Mr. Blackstone, I appreciate your time, but we need to address a serious contractual issue that affects my compensation and potentially dozens of other developers." His smile faltered slightly as my first slide appeared on the screen, displaying the exact text of my royalty clause alongside financial records showing TechFlow's licensing revenue from my compression algorithm. I watched his face carefully as he processed the information, noting the subtle shift from confidence to concern in his expression. "According to my employment contract, I am entitled to 15% of all licensing revenue generated by my intellectual property." I continued advancing to the next slide that detailed the $78 million Patterson Industries payment. This algorithm has generated over $200 million in total licensing fees, meaning the company currently owes me approximately $30 million in unpaid royalties. Blackstone leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against his desktop as he calculated the financial implications of my presentation. "Ophelia, I think there may be some confusion about how intellectual property agreements work in a corporate environment. Your innovations were created as work for hire under company resources, which typically excludes individual royalty entitlements." I had anticipated this response and immediately displayed copies of contracts from 3 major tech companies that included similar royalty clauses, proving that employee intellectual property rights were standard practice in the software industry. My contract explicitly guarantees royalty payments regardless of work-for-hire status. This is legally binding language that cannot be unilaterally modified without my written consent. The CEO's demeanor shifted dramatically as he realized I had done extensive legal research and could not be easily dismissed with corporate doublespeak. He stood up and walked to his window, staring out at the storm while clearly trying to formulate a response that would not constitute an admission of guilt. "These contract clauses were written by our previous legal team," he finally said, his voice lacking its earlier warmth. "Current company policy does not recognize individual royalty claims because they create unsustainable financial obligations that could bankrupt the organization. Company policy cannot override legal contracts," I replied, advancing to my most damning evidence, especially when executives have been systematically defrauding employees by hiding royalty payments and forging contract amendments to cover up the theft. I displayed screenshots of the offshore accounts and electronic signature logs showing Jake Patterson's fraudulent activities, watching Blackstone's face turn pale as the scope of my investigation became clear. His confident executive persona crumbled as he realized I possessed evidence that could result in federal criminal charges. "How much do you want?" he asked bluntly, abandoning any pretense of legality. "I can authorize a settlement payment that resolves this matter confidentially without involving lawyers or government agencies." His immediate offer to pay confirmed everything I had suspected about TechFlow's deliberate fraud scheme. I activated the recording app on my phone, ensuring that his admission would be captured for potential legal proceedings before responding to his settlement proposal. "I want every penny owed according to my contract, plus damages for the emotional distress and professional harm caused by your illegal concealment of my rights," I said firmly. "I also want assurance that other affected developers receive their owed royalties and that this systematic fraud stops immediately." Blackstone returned to his desk and opened a locked drawer, pulling out a check already made out to me for $100,000. "This is a generous settlement that exceeds what any court would award for a contract dispute. In exchange, you sign a confidentiality agreement and resign from TechFlow with positive references for future employment. The pre-written check proved that he had anticipated this confrontation and prepared a bribe to silence me before I could expose the broader fraud scheme. I realized that other developers had probably been offered similar settlements, explaining why the systematic theft had continued for years without public exposure. Mr. Blackstone, that check represents less than 1% of what you legally owe me, I replied, pushing the check back across his desk. Your willingness to pay anything confirms that you know exactly how much money has been stolen from developers, and your settlement offer constitutes an admission of guilt. His expression hardened as he realized that intimidation and bribery would not resolve this situation in his favor. Ophelia, I strongly advise you to reconsider this confrontational approach. TechFlow has significant legal resources and political connections that could make your life very difficult if you choose to pursue this matter further. I smiled confidently as I began packing up my presentation materials, knowing that his threats were being recorded and would provide additional evidence of corporate corruption for federal investigators. Mr. Blackstone, I strongly advise you to consult with your legal team about the criminal penalties for contract fraud, employee intimidation, and conspiracy to deprive workers of their contractual compensation. As I stood to leave his office, Blackstone made one final desperate attempt to control the situation. If you file any legal complaints or contact any government agencies, I will personally ensure that you never work in the tech industry again. Your career will be over, and your reputation will be destroyed. I paused at his door and turned back with a calm smile. Mr. Blackstone, my career is just beginning. And when federal investigators start examining your offshore accounts and Jake Patterson's forged signatures, your career will be the one that's over. Walking out of his office, I felt a surge of empowerment that completely overwhelmed my previous anxiety about confronting corporate leadership. The recording of his bribery attempt and criminal threats provided irrefutable evidence that TechFlow's executive team had knowingly defrauded their employees for years. My phone was already buzzing with a text from Diana asking how the meeting went, but I decided to wait until I reached my car before calling her with the explosive results. Richard Blackstone had just provided me with everything needed to trigger a federal investigation that would expose the entire fraud scheme and bring justice for every exploited developer. As I drove home through the continuing thunderstorm, I realized that my confrontation with the CEO had transformed this situation from a contractual dispute into a criminal case that could fundamentally change how the tech industry treats employee intellectual property rights. The next morning, I sat in the downtown offices of Foster Barnes & Associates, watching attorney Margaret Foster review my evidence with the intensity of a prosecutor preparing for trial. Diana had recommended Margaret as one of Austin's most aggressive employment lawyers, and her reputation for taking on corporate giants was exactly what I needed. Margaret was a formidable woman in her early 50s with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to analyze every detail of my documentation with surgical precision. She had built her career destroying companies that exploited their workers, and TechFlow's systematic fraud scheme was exactly the type of case that energized her fighting spirit. Ophelia, this is not just an employment dispute, she said after reviewing my recorded conversation with CEO Blackstone. This is a federal criminal conspiracy involving mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and violation of the RICO Act. We are talking about potential prison time for everyone involved in this scheme. I felt a mixture of excitement and terror as Margaret explained the scope of legal action we could pursue against TechFlow Solutions. My personal case was just the tip of an iceberg that could expose corporate fraud affecting dozens of companies and hundreds of employees across the tech industry. Margaret immediately filed a formal complaint with the Texas Labor Commission and requested an emergency injunction preventing TechFlow from destroying any documents related to employee intellectual property agreements. She also contacted the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division to report potential federal violations that exceeded state jurisdiction. Within hours of filing our initial paperwork, TechFlow's legal team responded with a vicious counterattack designed to intimidate me into withdrawing my complaint. They filed a frivolous lawsuit claiming I had violated my employment agreement by accessing confidential financial records, seeking damages, and immediate termination of my employment. This is standard corporate retaliation, Margaret explained as we reviewed TechFlow's aggressive response. They are trying to frighten you with legal costs and professional consequences, but their defensive posture actually strengthens our case by demonstrating their awareness of wrongdoing. The workplace retaliation began immediately and intensely. My keycard access to development servers was completely revoked. My company email account was restricted to internal messages only, and I was excluded from all team meetings and project discussions. Jake Patterson seemed to take personal satisfaction in my professional isolation, smirking whenever he walked past my now empty cubicle. But Margaret had anticipated this response and used TechFlow's retaliation as additional evidence of corporate misconduct in our federal complaint. Every petty action the company took against me became another criminal count in our growing case file. The breakthrough moment came when Margaret's investigation team discovered that Patterson Industries had been completely unaware of the royalty clauses in their licensing agreements with TechFlow. The client company had been paying premium prices for software innovations, believing the extra costs were being distributed to the developers who created the valuable intellectual property. Patterson Industries thought they were supporting innovation incentives, Margaret explained during our strategy meeting. They had no idea that TechFlow was stealing royalty payments and keeping everything for corporate profit. This makes Patterson a victim of the fraud scheme, not an accomplice. Margaret contacted Patterson Industries' legal department and discovered they were furious about being deceived by TechFlow's dishonest business practices. Patterson had built their licensing agreements around the assumption that developers received fair compensation for their innovations, and learning about the systematic theft fundamentally changed their relationship with TechFlow. The media attention began when Austin Business Journal published an investigative article about my case, focusing on the broader implications for tech worker rights throughout Texas. The story caught the attention of national publications, and soon reporters from TechCrunch and Wired were calling Margaret's office requesting interviews about corporate exploitation in the software industry. TechFlow's stock price began dropping as investors realized the company faced potential criminal charges and massive financial liability from years of systematic fraud. The negative publicity attracted attention from securities regulators, who started investigating whether TechFlow had misrepresented their intellectual property costs in public financial statements. Margaret's team expanded their investigation beyond my individual case and discovered a network of interconnected companies using similar fraud schemes to exploit software developers across multiple states. TechFlow was apparently part of a larger corporate conspiracy that acquired small tech firms specifically to steal their employees' intellectual property rights. We are looking at potentially the largest employment fraud case in tech industry history, Margaret told me during one of our weekly strategy sessions. The Department of Justice is now treating this as a priority investigation, with national implications for worker protection laws. The personal cost of fighting TechFlow became increasingly severe as the company's retaliation escalated beyond workplace harassment. I received anonymous threatening phone calls at home, my car tires were slashed in my apartment complex parking lot, and someone broke into my mailbox to steal correspondence from Margaret's office. Diana helped me install a security system in our apartment and accompanied me to work each day for protection against potential physical intimidation. The stress of constant harassment was exhausting, but Margaret assured me that TechFlow's desperate tactics proved we were winning the legal battle. They only threaten people when they know they are going to lose in court, she explained. Legitimate companies defend themselves with lawyers and evidence, not with intimidation and sabotage. The federal investigation gained momentum when FBI agents interviewed me about TechFlow's offshore banking practices and their systematic concealment of employee compensation. The agents were particularly interested in the company's acquisition strategy and their pattern of targeting innovative developers with valuable intellectual property. Tommy Rodriguez agreed to cooperate with federal investigators after being offered whistleblower protection, providing access to TechFlow's internal database systems and detailed financial records that had been hidden from previous inquiries. His testimony revealed that the fraud scheme extended back over 5 years and involved deliberate targeting of employees whose innovations generated the highest licensing revenues. As winter approached, Margaret felt confident that we had built an unassailable case against TechFlow's executive leadership and their corporate partners. The evidence was overwhelming. The media attention was increasing public pressure for accountability, and federal investigators were preparing criminal indictments that would send a clear message about corporate fraud in the tech industry. But Margaret warned me that TechFlow would likely make one final desperate attempt to avoid criminal prosecution, potentially offering a massive settlement that could resolve the civil case while still allowing federal prosecutors to pursue criminal charges against the executives who had orchestrated the systematic theft of employee compensation. January brought a shocking development that transformed my individual case into a massive federal investigation spanning 15 states and involving dozens of corporate entities. Patterson Industries announced they were joining my lawsuit as a co-plaintiff, claiming TechFlow had defrauded them for over 3 years across multiple licensing agreements. Margaret arranged a meeting with Patterson's legal team at their corporate headquarters in Dallas, where I learned the stunning scope of TechFlow's deception. Patterson had paid premium licensing fees specifically because TechFlow represented that their developers received substantial royalty compensation for their innovations. "We structured our licensing agreements around supporting innovation incentives," explained Patterson's general counsel, Elena Rodriguez. TechFlow's marketing materials explicitly stated that their unique compensation model attracted the industry's most talented developers because they shared directly in the financial success of their creations. Patterson Industries had paid an additional 40% above market rates for licensing agreements, believing the extra money was funding developer royalties that encouraged continued innovation and excellence. Discovering that TechFlow had stolen every penny of those payments fundamentally violated the trust underlying their business relationship. Elena showed us internal Patterson communications, where TechFlow executives had praised their company's commitment to fair developer compensation, while simultaneously stealing millions of dollars from the very employees they claimed to support. The hypocrisy was breathtaking and provided powerful evidence of deliberate fraud designed to manipulate client relationships. Within days of Patterson joining our lawsuit, 3 other major clients contacted Margaret's office to report similar deceptions in their licensing agreements with TechFlow. The fraud scheme was far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected, involving fabricated employee compensation structures designed to justify premium pricing while maximizing corporate profits. The investigation expanded further when IRS agents joined the federal task force focusing on TechFlow's offshore banking practices and their systematic concealment of taxable income from employee royalty payments. The company had not only stolen money from their developers, but had also evaded federal taxes on the unreported compensation, adding tax fraud to the growing list of criminal charges. Margaret's team discovered that Jake Patterson's role was even more sinister than we had initially understood. He had been specifically recruited from a corporate consulting firm that specialized in suppressing employee rights and destroying evidence of workplace violations. His hiring was part of a deliberate strategy to institutionalize fraud within TechFlow's operations. Jake was not just covering up existing crimes, Margaret explained during our strategy meeting. He was actively creating new systems to identify valuable employee innovations and ensure that royalty payments were diverted before developers could discover their contractual rights. The psychological manipulation was particularly disturbing. Jake had deliberately cultivated friendly relationships with developers, encouraging them to share details about their projects and career goals, while secretly documenting which innovations had the highest commercial potential for exploitation. FBI investigators revealed that TechFlow maintained detailed profiles on every developer, including personal financial information, family circumstances, and psychological assessments designed to predict how likely each employee was to challenge contract violations. The company had essentially created a scientific approach to employee exploitation. The evidence became even more damaging when federal agents discovered that TechFlow's parent company, Nexus Acquisitions, had purchased 17 smaller tech firms over the past decade using the same fraud methodology. The systematic nature of the exploitation suggested a coordinated criminal enterprise rather than isolated corporate misconduct. Margaret arranged for me to testify before a federal grand jury investigating the broader conspiracy, where I described how TechFlow's fraud had affected my personal life and professional development. The grand jury was particularly interested in the company's retaliation tactics and their attempts to intimidate employees who discovered contract violations. During my testimony, I learned that federal investigators had documented similar intimidation campaigns against 34 other developers across multiple companies owned by Nexus Acquisitions. The pattern was consistent: identify valuable innovations, steal royalty payments, threaten employees who complained, and systematically destroy evidence of wrongdoing. The media attention reached national prominence when 60 Minutes contacted Margaret about featuring my case in an investigative segment about corporate fraud in the tech industry. The producers were particularly interested in the systematic nature of the exploitation and its implications for innovation incentives throughout American technology companies. TechFlow's stock price collapsed completely when news of the federal investigation became public, dropping from $42 per share to less than $3 as investors fled the company. Several board members resigned immediately, and CEO Richard Blackstone hired a prominent criminal defense attorney to represent him in the growing federal case. The most shocking revelation came when Jake Patterson, now facing potential federal prison time, approached Margaret with an offer to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for immunity. He possessed recordings of executive meetings where board members had explicitly discussed strategies for stealing employee compensation without triggering legal liability. Jake has been secretly recording conversations for over 2 years, Margaret told me after meeting with his attorney. He apparently realized that TechFlow's executives would eventually use him as a scapegoat and decided to protect himself by documenting their criminal discussions. Jake's recordings revealed that CEO Richard Blackstone and the entire board of directors had planned the fraud scheme systematically, researching legal loopholes and consulting with offshore banking specialists to maximize their theft while minimizing detection risks. The conversations included explicit discussions about which employees to target and how much money could be stolen before triggering regulatory attention. The recordings also documented meetings where executives celebrated successful thefts, laughing about naive developers who trusted their employers, and discussing strategies for expanding the fraud scheme to other companies within their acquisition network. The callous disregard for employee welfare was genuinely shocking, even to experienced prosecutors. As federal indictments approached, TechFlow made a desperate attempt to destroy evidence by implementing a company-wide policy requiring deletion of all emails and documents older than 90 days. But federal agents had already secured preservation orders, and the attempted obstruction of justice added additional criminal charges against company leadership. Margaret warned me that the final phase of the investigation would be the most dangerous, as desperate executives might resort to extreme measures to avoid federal prison sentences. She arranged for FBI protection and advised me to vary my daily routines while prosecutors prepared their criminal case against the entire TechFlow leadership team. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering: 17 companies, 347 developers, and over $1 billion in stolen compensation, spanning 8 years of systematic fraud. My discovery of the royalty clause had uncovered the largest employee exploitation scheme in American tech industry history. Spring arrived with a flurry of federal indictments that sent shockwaves through the entire technology industry. CEO Richard Blackstone, 7 board members, and 12 other executives across the Nexus Acquisitions network were simultaneously arrested on charges, including racketeering, money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud employees of their contractual compensation. The coordinated arrests were the result of a 6-month federal investigation that had expanded far beyond my original complaint to encompass a systematic pattern of corporate fraud affecting hundreds of developers across multiple states. Margaret's office had become the unofficial headquarters for a legal team representing over 200 individual plaintiffs seeking compensation for stolen royalties. Jake Patterson's cooperation with federal prosecutors had provided the crucial evidence needed to prove criminal intent at the highest levels of corporate leadership. His secret recordings revealed planning sessions where executives had calculated exactly how much money they could steal from each developer while maintaining plausible deniability about contract violations. The defendants treated employee theft like a mathematical optimization problem, federal prosecutor David Chen explained during a press conference announcing the indictments. They systematically identified the most valuable innovations, calculated the maximum amount they could steal without triggering immediate legal challenges, and implemented sophisticated concealment strategies to hide their crimes from both employees and clients. TechFlow's desperate attempt to offer a $50 million global settlement to all affected developers was immediately rejected by Margaret and the other attorneys representing fraud victims. The settlement offer, while substantial, represented less than 10% of the actual damages calculated by forensic accountants examining the company's financial records. "We are not interested in helping these criminals avoid accountability," Margaret announced during a joint press conference with other plaintiff attorneys. "The evidence shows systematic theft of over $1 billion from hardworking developers who trusted their employers to honor legal contracts. Any settlement must include full compensation plus punitive damages that deter future corporate fraud." The criminal trials began in federal court with unprecedented media attention, focused on the implications for employee rights throughout the technology industry. Legal experts described the case as a watershed moment that would fundamentally change how corporations handle intellectual property agreements with their technical staff. During my testimony as the lead government witness, I described the emotional impact of discovering that my breakthrough innovation had generated massive profits while I struggled to pay rent and student loans. The contrast between TechFlow's celebration of record revenues and my financial stress powerfully illustrated the human cost of corporate greed. "I believed I was part of a team that valued innovation and rewarded creativity," I told the jury. "Instead, I learned that my employer viewed me as a resource to be exploited, rather than a partner to be compensated fairly for my contributions to their success." The defense attorneys attempted to portray the fraud as a misunderstanding of complex contract language rather than deliberate criminal conduct. But Jake Patterson's recordings made their arguments completely unpersuasive. The jury heard executives laughing about stupid developers who failed to read their contracts carefully enough to discover the royalty clauses. Richard Blackstone's attempt to flee the country had backfired spectacularly, adding charges of attempted flight to avoid prosecution and confirming his awareness of guilt in the systematic fraud scheme. His arrest at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport had been captured by news cameras, creating an iconic image of corporate accountability that dominated business news coverage for weeks. The federal investigation's expansion revealed that Nexus Acquisitions had been operating as a sophisticated criminal enterprise designed specifically to acquire technology companies with valuable intellectual property and exploit their developer talent through contract fraud. The business model was essentially legalized theft disguised as corporate acquisition strategy. 3 board members decided to cooperate with prosecutors after realizing the overwhelming strength of the government's evidence, providing additional testimony about the planning and implementation of the fraud scheme. Their cooperation revealed internal documents showing that Nexus had consulted with criminal attorneys about how to structure their theft to minimize prosecution risks. Patterson Industries' decision to join our lawsuit had triggered a domino effect that brought 12 other major technology clients into the case as co-plaintiffs seeking damages for their unknowing participation in the fraud scheme. These companies had paid premium licensing fees based on TechFlow's false representations about their developer compensation practices. The financial impact on TechFlow and its parent company was catastrophic, with bankruptcy proceedings beginning as the full scope of their legal liability became clear. Forensic accountants calculated that the company faced potential damages exceeding $300 million in civil liability, in addition to criminal penalties and regulatory fines. Margaret's legal team had grown to include specialists in securities fraud, tax evasion, and international money laundering, as the investigation revealed the sophisticated financial structures used to conceal stolen employee compensation. The case had evolved into one of the most complex white-collar prosecutions in federal court history. The technology industry itself was grappling with the implications of the fraud revelation, as investors and employees demanded stronger protections for intellectual property rights and clearer contractual language governing innovation compensation. Several states introduced legislation requiring standardized royalty disclosure requirements for technology employment agreements. My personal transformation throughout the legal process had been profound, evolving from an exploited employee seeking basic fairness to a national advocate for technology worker rights. Speaking at conferences and testifying before congressional committees about corporate fraud had given me a platform to help other developers understand and protect their contractual rights. The stress and danger of fighting such a powerful corporate conspiracy had been enormous, but the growing support from fellow developers and the broader technology community provided emotional strength to continue pursuing justice. Hundreds of developers had contacted Margaret's office with similar stories of contract exploitation creating a movement for accountability that extended far beyond my individual case. As the criminal trials progressed toward their inevitable conclusion, I realized that my discovery of the royalty clause had triggered a fundamental shift in how the technology industry treats employee intellectual property. The corporate fraud that had initially seemed like a personal betrayal had become a catalyst for systematic reform that would protect future generations of innovators from similar exploitation. The final phase of legal proceedings would determine not just the fate of TechFlow's executives, but the broader question of whether corporate America would continue tolerating systematic theft of employee compensation or finally implement meaningful accountability for executive criminal conduct. 9 months after my confrontation with CEO Richard Blackstone Federal Court delivered the justice I had never dared to imagine possible when this journey began. The criminal trials concluded with guilty verdicts on all major charges, resulting in prison sentences that sent an unmistakable message about accountability for corporate fraud in the technology industry. Richard Blackstone received 12 years in federal prison for racketeering, fraud, and money laundering, along with forfeiture of his personal assets and permanent prohibition from serving as a corporate officer. 7 other TechFlow executives received sentences ranging from 4 to 8 years, while Jake Patterson's cooperation earned him immunity and a substantial whistleblower reward from the government. The civil litigation produced an even more satisfying outcome than Margaret had initially predicted. After 3 weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury awarded our class of developers $76 million in compensatory damages, with an additional $90 million in punitive damages designed to deter future corporate fraud schemes throughout the industry. My personal share of the settlement totaled $11.8 million, representing the royalties owed under my original contract, plus interest and damages for the emotional distress caused by TechFlow's systematic deception and retaliation. The financial security was transformative, but the broader impact on industry practices felt even more meaningful. Patterson Industries offered me the position of Chief Innovation Officer with a compensation package that included equity participation and guaranteed intellectual property rights for all future innovations. Their commitment to transparent developer compensation had emerged stronger from their experience as fraud victims, creating a model for ethical business practices that other companies began adopting voluntarily. The legislative impact exceeded everyone's expectations when Congress passed the Technology Worker Protection Act, establishing federal standards for intellectual property agreements and creating criminal penalties for corporate executives who systematically defraud their technical employees. My testimony before the House Technology Subcommittee had helped shape key provisions protecting developer royalty rights. Diana completed law school with highest honors and joined my newly established foundation as Chief Legal Counsel, focusing on providing free legal assistance to technology workers facing contract disputes with their employers. Our foundation had already helped 63 developers recover over $14 million in stolen compensation during its first year of operation. Margaret Foster became a national celebrity in employment law circles, with her aggressive prosecution of corporate fraud earning recognition from the American Bar Association and invitations to speak at law schools across the country. Her firm specialized in technology industry cases, representing developers whose innovations were being exploited by unethical employers. The investigation revealed that Nexus Acquisitions had systematically stolen over $1.2 billion from developers across their portfolio companies, making it the largest employment fraud case in American history. The company's bankruptcy and dissolution created opportunities for ethical investors to acquire valuable technology assets while implementing fair compensation practices. Tommy Rodriguez used his whistleblower reward to start his own software development company, implementing transparent intellectual property agreements that became an industry standard for ethical business practices. His company's success demonstrated that treating developers fairly actually improved innovation outcomes and competitive advantages. Jake Patterson's transformation from corporate enforcer to whistleblower had been remarkable, driven by his realization that TechFlow's executives viewed him as expendable despite his loyalty to their criminal enterprise. His cooperation had been crucial to exposing the broader conspiracy and bringing justice to hundreds of exploited developers. The technology industry's response to the scandal included widespread adoption of standardized royalty disclosure requirements and independent oversight of intellectual property agreements. Several major corporations voluntarily implemented compensation review processes to ensure compliance with developer rights, fearing regulatory action and negative publicity. My personal growth throughout this experience had been transformative, evolving from a naive employee who trusted corporate promises to a confident advocate who understood the importance of protecting worker rights against systematic exploitation. The skills I developed fighting tech flow served me well in my new role promoting industry-wide reform. The foundation I established has become a crucial resource for technology workers nationwide, providing legal assistance, contract review services, and educational programs about intellectual property rights. We have helped transform the power dynamic between developers and corporations, ensuring that innovation receives fair compensation rather than systematic theft. The emotional satisfaction of achieving complete victory against such a powerful corporate conspiracy cannot be adequately described. Seeing Richard Blackstone in handcuffs reading headlines about executive accountability and receiving thank you messages from developers whose cases were inspired by my courage created a sense of purpose that transcended personal financial gain. Looking back on this incredible journey, I realized that discovering the royalty clause in my employment contract was just the beginning of a much larger story about corporate accountability and worker empowerment. My willingness to fight for what was legally and morally right had created a ripple effect that protected thousands of other developers from similar exploitation. The life lesson from this experience is profound individual courage to challenge injustice can create systematic change that benefits entire industries and protects future generations of workers. When corporations systematically exploit their employees, silence enables continued abuse, but speaking truth to power can expose corruption and force meaningful reform. Standing up for your contractual rights, even against powerful opponents with unlimited legal resources, can lead to both personal vindication and broader social progress. The technology industry is stronger and more ethical because hundreds of developers found the courage to share their stories and demand accountability from corporate leadership. My story proves that justice is possible when individuals refuse to accept exploitation and demand the compensation they have legally earned through their creativity and hard work. The systematic change we achieved will protect countless future innovators from the theft and deception that once seemed impossible to challenge successfully. Have you ever discovered that your employer was hiding compensation you had legally earned? And how did you find the courage to fight for what was rightfully yours? Please share your experiences in the comments below. Hit the like button. If this story inspired you to stand up for your workplace rights, subscribe for more stories about overcoming corporate injustice, and share this video with anyone who needs encouragement to fight for fair treatment at work. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey from exploitation to empowerment, and I wish you the strength to never accept less than the respect and compensation you deserve in your own career.